hoping, obviously, that you've had a chance to virtually watch a virtual screening of the Divided Brain, the documentary that was made 2 years ago, featuring Iain McGilchrist, who is here with us from the Isle of Skye. I will give him a longer and more formal, we'll give him a longer introduction tomorrow at his talk tomorrow morning. But for now, I think we need to get started with the question and answer session. We're intending for this to last for half an hour or so. And the format will be, if you type into the chat box, at the moment that goes directly to me. I haven't made it sort of a general one. And I'll probably ask you to ask your question out loud for Iain. Remember to unmute yourself before that happens. Otherwise, please stay muted so we don't get any weird feedback. I will start off with asking Iain about the documentary he's just made. It clearly involved a lot of travel. So was there anywhere you went in the video where you to make the documentary video where you hadn't been before?
Yes, there was. There was. I went. Probably for me the outstanding experience was going up into Alberta, where I'd never been, in northern Canada, and meeting Leroy Littlebear. So that was wonderful, and in its own way, it was quite like my experience of Skye. But also just the business of meeting somebody from that culture and being able to talk to them was fantastic. I think all the other places I went, I'd probably been before. Okay, thank you. Right, and the good thing is that's given a few people a chance to ask the question. So could I get, I think it's Carol Milne, if you unmute yourself, could you ask your question to Iain about the dominant hand thing? Hello. Yes,
talking to someone yesterday about film, and she's left-handed, and she wants to know, how does the left brain work in the dominant hand? How does that affect people who don't have a dominant right hand? Well, dominant right hand. Left-handed people. Well,
yes, it's a good question. It's not an easy one to say briefly. I deal with it quite glancingly at the beginning of the book, but I suppose one of the most important lateralizing, one of the most reliable lateralizing features is speech, which is not the same, of course, as all language, but speech for most right-handers, 97%, is in the left frontal lobe, but in 3% of even right-handers, it's in the right. And when you come to left-handers, 60% is in the left frontal lobe and 40 on the right. So it's not like a clean flip or anything like that. Also, left-handers are not a single bunch. So there are occasionally people for whom it is a clean flip, in which case whatever I say about the right hemisphere refers to their left and vice versa. And there are some people who are left-handers for whom more or less the brain organization is very similar to, as it were, the standard model. But the interesting thing to me is the cases, which are quite a few, of people who are left-handers in whom there are new assortments, as it were, going on. So that in a way their right hemisphere is acting partly as a right hemisphere and partly as a left hemisphere, and so for the other one. And that has, in some cases, advantages and in some cases disadvantages. So you tend to find that left-handers are overrepresented both at the bottom and the top of most distributions for most skills.
Oh, it's interesting. Unless I look at her brain, I won't know.
No. Okay, thank you for that. Could we have Willie Grieve? Would you like to ask your question to Iain, Willie?
Iain, my question was about Jill Bolte Taylor's experience, and I remember being at a talk you gave some years ago, and I asked you then, and it was something along the lines that after a stroke, there's just too much kind of chaos and matter, as it were, floating around in the brain to be able to make any reliable inferences from behavior or subjective experience. And I noted in the film that you had expressed a kind of proviso, but without belittling, you know, her lived experience of it. And I just wondered if you might expand on that.
Yes, I mean, we learn a lot from strokes. So I'm not certainly saying that, particularly after the initial, perhaps first 12, 24 hours, there aren't very important and interesting phenomena for us to observe. Of course, it's a tragedy often for the person, but unfortunately, science progresses by observing these personal misfortunes, and it's something good that can come of it. I suppose what I felt was that Jill Bolte Taylor has become a bit of an internet star, saying a lot of slightly, to me, oversimple things, really. Things that she's not really in a position to say. And I think that she has herself said, if you want to know about brain differences, don't ask me, ask Iain. So, but I have been slightly dogged by people saying, oh, that's all that thing where Jill Bolte Taylor has a stroke and suddenly she's in La La Land. And I have to sort of try to distance myself from that because, of course, it's nothing like La La Land. And that may be something that she experienced. But as I tried to say in the film, it's a bit more complicated than that. And I know that if Jill Bolte Taylor were here, she would agree with me about that. It's just that the way the film was set up, I insisted that I had the opportunity to say that. Otherwise, people would think that I, you know, agreed with everything she says, which I don't, I'm afraid.
I think, Iain, I sort of know what you mean. I read Jill's book after seeing her TED talk, and I thought the book gave a bit more of a balanced, a little bit more of a balanced discussion. Also, she was much clearer about how painful and long the recovery was. I thought on the TED talk, you got the kind of idea that she had this wonderful mystical experience and her life was much better. And actually, the book is very honest about the pain she went through and the sort of long, hard road of recovery. So I think there's only so much you can communicate.
Oh, absolutely. And the trouble with a film is that you are necessarily limited to a very short,
Yes.
You know, really a few sound bites.
Yes.
Something I should have thought about earlier on. but in any case, for somebody like poor Jill coming in, she wasn't able to say all the things she could have said. And I
Yes.
must say, I found her exactly as I would have imagined, an enormously courageous, insightful and delightful person.
Okay, could Robin, you've asked a question about objections, so would you like to unmute yourself and put that one to Iain?
Hi, yes, I would like to ask about the objections to your theory, and what would you say the strongest objections are that you've encountered and how you counter them?
Well, it's very difficult because most critics, and I'm very glad to say that I have many people in the world of neuroscience who take what I have to say very seriously, but most of those who've been critics have not really, it seems to me, got to grips with what it is I'm saying. Either they've read a summary or they've assumed they know what it is I'm saying. And so their criticisms, to be honest, I wish I could say that they were devastating, but they seem to be far from trenchant because they haven't really got to grips with what it is I'm actually saying. There's often, the worst thing that can happen is that somebody can just say, and it costs them nothing to say it, you cherry pick the data. Well, it's impossible to refute that because the only possible answer is, well, you spend 20 years looking at the literature and then prepare a book of your own, and I will pick holes in what you have to say. But of course, that's never going to happen. So it's very difficult for me, actually. It's a cheap thing to say, but it's virtually impossible to refute. And it's hurtful, because I've no interest in peddling some kind of lie. I'm only interested in the truth as I see it. And I spent years sweating over what looks to me like a reasonable picture. The difficulty, of course, always is that when you're dealing with something as complex as the brain, or indeed anything to do with the human being, nature is not like a maths problem. So there isn't just one set of things that will always follow a certain path. Human beings are massively complex. And so part of the art is, on the one hand, not disregarding data that just don't happen to fit with your thesis, which would be the cherry picking. But the other part is not being derailed from a perfectly good point of view by the fact that some of the data don't quite fit, because they're never going to completely fit. So it's finding your way through that. And I feel I've done a fairly good job of it. In the book I've just written, there's an enormous amount more data. I mean, my editor is going to have a heart attack, because it's about twice the length of the Master and his Emissary, and it's got about twice as many references. And but that's because I feel it's important to try and be as thorough as one possibly can, because, you know, having spent so much of my life on this, I'm damned if people are going to say, well, you weren't actually fair to what is there in the science, because I've made it, I've sweated blood over doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. There are a few questions that have a similar kind of theme. So I'll get one of the people. Kate Threadgold, would you like to unmute yourself and ask? You're quite representative of 3 or 4 people's questions, but go ahead.
Yeah, my question was really to what degree or to what extent could the current coronavirus and lockdown be an opportunity to rebalance the scales?
Well, yes. Very hard to say. I mean, the first thing I ought to say is that anything I say is backed by the fact that I understand the human suffering that will be caused and has already been caused, and more will be caused. So I don't disregard that, but it has achieved so far, and it may go on achieving it for some time, a slowdown in pollution of the natural world and destruction of the natural world that could not possibly been achieved by any other means. There simply isn't any other means. Even an all-out war would have been more likely to destroy. But actually this virus is almost like Gaia's best trump card, because it has given the natural world a break. And that's a good thing, of course, in itself, whether it be long enough or not, and whether we'll respect what we've learned from it once we're able to carry on polluting at the levels that we once did. I don't know. I'm a little doubtful that we will remember, although for a time we will, and some people will always do. I think there are many other things that help to redress the balance, and one is I think it's awoken a communitarian spirit, which I don't think it's sort of invented. I think that people have always wanted actually to do good things for other people, but in some ways our society is so organized that the responsibility for such acts is taken over by large corporate concerns, be it government or bureaucracies of various kinds, or indeed large commercial organizations. So that the opportunity actually to put yourself out to do good to your neighbor has been something that's relatively new perhaps for some people, and has certainly become a more prominent part of the way of life. That's not to say that there aren't people who've capitalized on it to you know, do disgraceful and antisocial things, but I'm afraid you know, if you still think that the human race is a perfect species, then you've got a lot to learn. But I think there's a great deal of good that can come out of it. It's a question of whether we can hang on to it in the longer term.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to ask now. Again, there's
sorry. Can I just add something?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just add something? Yes, which is that one thing that's rather hard to express, but I think is really important, is it has recontextualized life. It's as though, in a way, the image of the age is the selfie, which is a camera right up against your face. And what this virus and this pandemic has done is to draw the camera back so that you are seen within, and we see ourselves within a broader context, which includes a bigger span of time and space, of other people in the world, of those who come after us and came before us, and of the fact of death. And actually confronting death is an extraordinarily important part of being alive, and one that on the whole our civilization has tended to run away from. And only good can come from confronting it. Sorry, I just thought I'd say that.
Could I get Virianaya to ask her question? There are a few questions again with a similar theme, but I'll let her ask her question if she unmutes herself.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, my training was in logic and philosophy and linguistics, so very sort of left brain. But
sorry,
yeah.
What?
Sorry, did you not hear me?
So the connection was not very good, and I didn't catch what you said.
Okay, I'll try. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So my academic training was in logic, philosophy, linguistics, so very left brain, systematic. But since then, I've been learned to meditate. I now teach meditation and Buddhist ritual and mandala making. Now, I imagine that I know that my mind has changed, and I imagine that my brain has changed too. So for me, those sorts of activities are probably, but I'm not an expert, very good for rebalancing and becoming more into the right hemisphere and valuing the right hemisphere. So those particular activities for me have been very powerful. But what would you recommend? Would you recommend meditation or ritual or making?
Absolutely, I would. You've hit the nail on the head, and it's very apropos of the Middle Way conference. There is, if one needed it, hard evidence that meditation, particularly perhaps mindfulness meditation, tends to rebalance the two hemispheres. In the normal waking state, there's a slight preponderance to the left hemisphere in most people, about 1.2 to 1. But in meditation, it tends to normalize. And in the book I'm writing, I quote from a Buddhist monk who is the world authority on meditation, has written very interestingly about it. And in just a few paragraphs, he mentions 23 things that to me look like signs that it's actually engaging the right hemisphere rather than the left. So I think meditation is one of the very most obvious ways in which we can undertake something on a daily basis, which will help to redress the imbalance that our culture induces in us to some extent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question from Sebastian. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Sebastian.
Yes, hello. Well, you say in the documentary that your purpose is to inspire other people further developing your ideas. Do you see any interesting, promising, or perhaps non-expected developments in this regard?
Well, yes, thank you. It's hard to know what will be solid, but as time goes by, more and more people from different walks of life approach me, send me a copy of their book, and it might be in almost any area really, saying that my work had an influence on them. Interestingly, two of them have been novelists, one of them an Austrian novelist, but more regularly, it's people in the world of the humanities, of literature, philosophy, education particularly, and also, of a great surprise to me, the world of economics. And I'm probably one of the most ignorant people you could find when it comes to economics. It's always struck me as, you know, one has to not specialize in everything, and it went to the bottom of my list. And but economists are among, and business people indeed, and investors and financiers and advertising people have flocked to my door saying this is all extraordinarily pertinent to what we do. I have to take their word for it, but it does seem that that is the case. I can make one exception to not seeing quite what it is, and that's in the case of Orlando Wood, who recently wrote a book called Lemon, which has enjoyed some success. And he has extremely intelligently drawn on my work and applied it to advertising, which was something that I must say I never anticipated in my wildest dreams. What's more pleasing to me is that a lot of, well, particularly clinicians in the world of neurology and psychiatry, but also neuroscientists, are beginning to say this is fascinating, and we are, you know, working along these lines. And so, you know, generally speaking, from having felt that I was a voice crying in the wilderness, I feel that I now have a certain company around me of people who are interested and taking it somewhere. And I'm hoping that with time that will be more the case. So we will have to wait and see. But thank you.
Iain, a few people have asked, you mentioned a Buddhist monk, and there's been some interest in knowing if you could remember who that was. Or if you can't remember, is that in The Master and His Emissary? Sorry.
I think, no, I'm just going to try and find it for you. It's not in The Master and His Emissary, it's in my new book. His name is Bhante Hennepola Gunaratana.
Thank you.
So Gunaratana is probably the key thing. Bhante is a title, an honorific, but he is recognized as one of the great authorities on mindfulness meditation.
Okay, thank you for, thank you. That was a quick one. There's a question from Sandra. Sandra, do you want to unmute yourself and ask Iain your question?
Yeah, I'm in the dark. Sorry, I probably need
Okay.
to...
We can still hear you though. Yeah.
You can still hear me, that's fine.
Yes.
My question really was that only this year, I have a fellowship at Cambridge University, and I asked them, it's on shame with women in prison. And I said to them, the thing is, shame is very complex. I said, to just write this on a 10,000 word thesis is not doing any justice to shame. I said, I want to dance it. And literally the woman looked at me so shocked. And she said, no, 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 you must write this on paper in 10,000 words. And I looked at her, and the other supervisor said, but we could try this. And she went, no, no, it must be written. And I guess my question is, this thing that you raise is universities and this way of teaching. And I know there's the first PhD done now with no written, only one PhD that has been completely not written and shown in performance. So I have now gone to the Trinity Laban to take this research into a piece of work of dance. But I'm just really, that's my question, is how can we shift this? You know, how do we example this place of getting rid of this writing in this way?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I find your idea fascinating. I don't think we'll do away with the idea of a written thesis, and I also don't think we should. But it ought to be possible, perhaps, to be more flexible. My immediate feeling is, why bother? Why bother with a thesis? Why not embrace the dance? After all, lots of the most interesting things one comes across are not actually in the university structure. The university structure might have, for all kinds of not entirely bad reasons, to stick to certain kinds of formats and rules, but lots of good can happen outside that. And I'm now increasingly finding that the most exciting work in many fields is coming either from people who quite possibly were formerly academics and have moved out of academia in order to be able to say and do what they wish to do, or from people who have nothing whatever to do with academia. And I'm afraid that because the universities have become very dogmatic in the things they will do and they won't do, and things they will talk about and the things they won't talk about, and so on, they're busily digging their own graves. And, you know, there will come a point when people say, well, why do I need to go to a university? Why don't I do whatever? I mean, I think that's a shame in a way, because universities as they were very powerful and fine things, but I think they've now become so degraded and unwilling really to sort of embrace freedom of spirit, that I'm not really bothered whether they continue in their present form.
Thank you.
Sadly. I mean, it sounds like the end of civilization. What's more important than the universities? But I'm afraid I'm rather critical of them. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Someone has let me know the monk you mentioned has written a book called Mindfulness in Plain English. So that might help you to find it if you're interested.
That's right.
Yes, is that right?
Exactly right.
Iain, what was the title of your book that you mentioned that was from?
Oh, it's the book that I've just finished writing the first draft of, which has taken me about 7 years. It's called The Matter with Things.
Okay.
Or at least that's what I'm
does it have a title yet? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
The Matter with Things.
With Things. Yeah.
Yes, which is a sort of pun on several levels, and because it's about matter and things and their dominance and the problem that causes. Yes.
Okay. So I think we should just about have time for one more. Got a question from Lenny about animals in the film. So Lenny, if you're there, could you unmute and ask a question?
Yes, I just wondered how you felt about the use of animals in research. And obviously in the film it was pigeons, but I know they're not the only animals that get used in this kind of research. And it seemed to me very much sort of reflective of the sort of left brain, you know, just using them as commodities.
Yes, I'm very sympathetic to that. Fortunately, I've never had to do lab work. I suppose I recognize that along with many other people, not necessarily writers or scientists, but just people who benefit from medicines, that we are all beneficiaries of sacrifices made by animals without their consent, of course. Which is an impossibility. And I think it does speak of the mind that I worry about. But since there is very interesting information to be gleaned, and since research has been done, one cannot ignore it. So I feel conflicted about it. I'm conflicted, and my answer to it is not to be involved in it in some way. But of course, we're all involved with one another. And we can see in Shakespeare that this was at the time when people were beginning to do experiments on animals. And I think it's in Cymbeline, I can't remember. Anyway, one of the late plays, that he deals with this, and you can see that he is concerned and disturbed by it. And I think any ordinary human being would be and should be. Which is not to say that I necessarily believe that the pigeons that Professor Günther uses suffer. They may or they may not, and they might have suffered other things if they hadn't done the work they've done. I really wouldn't like to say, and I'm certainly not passing judgment on his standard of care or the care that's offered there. But I think the whole idea of instrumentalizing other creatures, which is probably what you're talking about, speaks of the desire for control and instrumentalization, which is at the core of the left hemisphere's view of the world. So a very fair question, and the answer is I'm not comfortable.
Thank you.
Right. So our time for this question and answer session is up. Obviously, we've had a lot more questions than we've had time to hear from, but I hope I've been reasonably even-handed in picking ones that are suitable for the occasion. Iain will be speaking tomorrow between 10 and 11 as part of the second day of our virtual festival. I'll be introducing him again on that occasion. And so I expect that we will see or virtually see many of you there. And I'd like to thank you all for participating and for everyone for asking questions. And especially thanks to Iain for being available to talk to us from his splendid isolation on the Isle of Skye.
Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to talking tomorrow. I hope not too much. I hope to leave mainly time for questions. Okay,
thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you in the morning. Okay, goodbye everyone else as well. See you in the